All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 1 of the podcast of Surprise. Really excited to be here today. We're going to be here to discuss the fantastic book series by Andrzej Sapkowski called The Witcher. This is a Witcher book club and podcast where we will be discussing and analyzing each chapter of the book series, starting with the collection of short stories in The Last Wish. But before we get into what you can expect from the podcast, the pod of surprise, as I like to call it, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Aziz. And as you can see, if you are looking at the stream, she's got it, Michal. I'll point it out for you. I often don't get it right. So that's why she did that. But let's start with you, Michal. What's going on?
Hi. Yeah. So recording from quarantine. My name is Michal Schick. I am an entertainment writer for Hypeable.com. And I recently fell into the Witcher world and haven't quite climbed my way back out yet. So I'm really excited to get started and talk about all of this old Polish man's amazing writing that I wasn't expecting to find.
He's a little bit less perverse than George R. R. Martin.
Slightly, yeah. Well, I have many thoughts about his sex scenes as compared to Martin's, but we can save that for another time.
Yeah, there aren't any in this one, but we've got time. It's a nice long process. We're getting started here.
And then we got Strig Aziz. I stole the Azor surprise. He did Aziz a surprise, so I stole that. So he had to get a new one.
There's lots of fun creatures and beasts and names and things we can form our new names around. So I'm sure to have fun with that. So yeah, a lot of y'all know me. I'm Aziz from History of Westeros podcast, and I like to read other fantasy and sci-fi. I'm not just all about Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, but this is the first other fandom / series that I liked enough to want to also podcast on. It takes a pretty significant level of inspiration to want to take this step. So for me, I'm excited that something came along that pushed me to take this step and to take for us to do this. So I'm really excited. It's a great series. It's got a lot of amazing influences that we love to discuss. There's lots of fun creatures and myths and just great characters and humor. And well, if you're new to it, we're going to explain all that to you. And if you're not new to it, then you know already and you're excited to talk about it too. So yeah, let's do it.
So me and Aziz did a couple of episodes. Some of you may have saw those already. This is kind of a rebirth, so to speak, because we're going to start off chronologically. We're going to go through that. So for those of you who have seen the couple episodes, we will be doing a grain of truth next after this one, but we'll talk about that after. But what can you expect? So I guess what can you expect from the pod of surprise is what we're going to talk about next here. Our podcast will have 2 formats, the one you're seeing live right now. So once a month, we will be going live on a Friday on YouTube where we'll have an awesome live discussion between the 3 of us, analyzing the chapters and having a more back and forth discussion. But also we're going to have an edited version of a downloadable podcast, and that's going to be a little bit more streamlined. So that's going to be worked on. Usually it'll come out probably a couple days after, and that'll be fun. We're going to try to grow this as a podcast and a live version. So 2 versions. This one will be taking questions and stuff like that, but 2 versions of the podcast. Now, our format, a really fun format. It's going to include starting with a synopsis. So, an overview of the chapter, short story discussing the timeline, the locations, and just giving an overall overview of what happens. Following the synopsis, we're going to have our own personal reactions because we all have our own view on the chapter. And we're going to talk about our likes, dislikes, and, overall takeaways from what we read. After that, we will get into craft, which is my personal favorite section, which will encompass, the themes like destiny and dilemmas, socio-political issues that we'll be talking about, techniques and literary devices that Sapkowski uses. So that's going to be really fun. And real-world myths and classical stories that have influenced the author. This section will focus a lot on the recurring themes that we see throughout the Witcher book series, but we'll also focus on the characters, the decisions they make, and ultimately how the magic influences culture and the societal hierarchies that we see often within medieval fantasies like this one. We will also have a very fun bestiary section, which you probably saw me and Aziz talk about in our previous iterations of what we're doing here. We're going to talk about our favorite critters. We're going to have a lore section discussing potions, tinctures, signs, spells, locations, and the history, of the elves and all of that. So that's going to be really fun. And to tie it all together, I think it's only fitting that we discuss our favorite moments and have a section where we kind of finish it off with some of the humor, because there's great humor in this story. So that'll kind of tie it up, but we're going to have a fun format for all of you. And this is mainly going to be a book podcast. I think it's important to tell you that we will have some fun episodes in the future. Maybe some standalone episodes on School of the Wolves, some stuff like that. There has been people in the comment section talking in my own videos, talking about specific characters and stuff like that. So that's not out of the question. And when the Witcher show comes back, we're certainly almost going to be doing discussions on each episode, because it'll be fun to do book show comparison stuff. So yeah, that's kind of what you can expect from the podcast, a surprise. And we're really excited to start out with episode number 1 right here. I do think I want to kind of start out before we kind of get into all our reactions. And I think I speak for all of us, and both Michal and Aziz can speak on this too. This is a really interesting time. Me and Aziz have been talking about this for a little bit. And then, of course, we got Michal involved as well. We were going to do this a little bit later, but I think this is kind of the perfect opportunity to start a podcast like this and start building a community. So I think it goes without saying that we hope all of you are staying safe during this time right now. And we hope that this podcast can help entertain you. And we invite each and every one of you to join our community and stay distracted and have some fun and dive into a new universe. So that's kind of the first announcement that we have and that we wanted to really get out there. But yeah, so let's get into the podcast. Let's go.
Shall we start with a quote?
Yeah.
Let's start with a quote.
All right. You inspire trust, he said. Although I know what a rogue you are. I was told what happened at the tavern. I'm sure you killed those thugs solely for word to spread, to shock people, to shock me. It's obvious that you could have dealt with them without killing. I'm afraid I'll never know whether you were going there to save my daughter or to kill her. But I agree to it. I have to agree. Do you know why? Geralt did not reply. Because I think, said the king, I think that she is suffering. Am I not right? The Witcher fixed his penetrating eyes on the king. He didn't confirm it, didn't nod, didn't make the slightest gesture, but Foltest knew. He knew the answer.
Oh, yeah. So we're going to also start, early part of each episode is going to have a synopsis. We're going to try to be pretty thorough with these synopses, because some of y'all haven't read the series yet, and I know you're trying to feel it out and decide whether this is going to be a series for you. So we're going to try to make sure you get a nice dose of what it is you'd be getting into if you do decide to get into it. So this is the first story presented, but it's not the first chronologically. Anyone who's seen the show as their first introduction knows that the timeline's a little wonky, but it all makes sense once you get into it. And part of the reason it's that way is it's just the way the books were written to start off with. Sapkowski wrote the Witcher short story, this first short story, in 1986. And from there, he added more short stories and just filled it out. Eventually, it became a big epic. But he didn't start here and decide that everything had to come after. He did a little bit of before, a little bit later. He jumped around a little bit until it all kind of was a little more straightened out. So this is going to be a recurring feature, meaning the timeline being a little strange, but it starts to become a lot more straightforward a little farther down. So this one actually takes place after he's met Yennefer, after he's earned the nickname Butcher of Blaviken. So when we actually cover the book as a whole, when we finish this book, we're going to do each short story individually. Then we're going to cover the Voice of Reason, which is the framework for all the short stories that are happening during it. And then we're going to do an episode where we discuss things that are a little spoilery, because there's connective tissue between the stories. There's things that come up in this story that come up again later. But for new folks, we're not going to talk about that right away. We're going to save that for a special episode. So let's get into it. Geralt the Witcher arrives in what I understand is pronounced Wichim or it looks like Wism. Anyway, yeah. Also called Vizima. So there's a couple names for it. We'll go with Wichim. And he heads to an inn called the Fox. He orders a beer, but is attacked by 3 locals who don't like Rivians, a sentiment that seems common in the area, perhaps. Geralt kills them quite easily and then waits. He knew he would not be well received, and by getting arrested, he believes he can get an audience with a high authority quickly enough because he seeks an audience with King Foltest, who has issued a proclamation declaring a dangerous task and a reward. Geralt carries a copy of this proclamation as he has come to fulfill it. He's taken to the Castellan of Wichim, named Velerad, an interesting jovial fellow, I suppose you could say. Maybe not jovial, but anyway, we'll talk about him later. He's upset with this transgression, but realizes there's more at stake when he learns why Geralt is there. So instead of arresting or imprisoning him, he calls for beer. Geralt finally gets that beer he was waiting for. He talks a lot after that. Velerad complains of monsters all over, remarking, it's no wonder witchers are needed. He explains the details of the proclamation, saying Foltest had a relationship with his own sister Ada, and she became pregnant. When the girl was born, the event and the child were so horrifying that one of the midwives jumped out the window to her death, and another was dazed so badly by the experience she's never completely recovered full brain function. The girl was cursed, it's determined, and she and her mother Ada died. So Foltest has his child and his sister buried together in a joint sarcophagus, and 7 years later, it emerges as a striga. 7 more years have passed since then, so 14 in total. And during that time, means were used to first discover what the creature was, and then what to do about it. People of varying scholarship and backgrounds have apparently, over the years, suggested a multitude of solutions, several of which, by the way, sound like the ways you kill vampires. But one of the suggestions was that the curse could be reversed. If someone spent the night by the sarcophagus, if the striga is kept out of its sarcophagus until the 3rd crowing of the cock, then the curse will be reversed. Maybe. So Foltest, given his relationship to the creature, latched onto this idea and offered what apparently is a very, very large reward of 3,000 orens. Now, some have tried. Some of those were killed in nasty ways, and fewer attempts have been made over the years. They've simply abandoned the castle, an entire castle where this striga lives, just abandoned because they just couldn't do anything about it. They just built a whole new castle. Like, well, this one's striga infested, so we need a new palace. So over time, though, bigger problems have come up, political issues. The striga kills people from time to time, but when you're a king ruling a large nation, you got bigger problems, right? So one of those problems is a nearby King Vizimir, who had wanted to marry this girl that eventually turned into a striga. So even other witchers have come. Most left when they heard it had to be a broken curse and not a dead striga. One tried and was killed. Eventually, though, a wealthy conspiracy of local nobles and other powerful people had grown tired of waiting for the curse to be broken, thinking it's just never going to happen. The curse can't be broken. They got frustrated with the wait. So they offered a similar reward, or a similar but smaller reward, for ignoring the king's wishes and killing it. The king wouldn't begrudge a witcher killing the creature in self-defense, after all, would he? One could always just claim, we tried to break the curse and it failed, so we had to take the last resort. I mean, how would the king know otherwise, right? Right? Maybe not. Another witcher accepted this new under-the-table proposition. He set out to do some reconnaissance, right? You want to see what you're getting into. Probably doing the kind of groundwork we're seeing Geralt do right here at the beginning. However, this unnamed witcher, after getting one look at the striga, just peaced out. He's like, nope, no thanks. Geralt, however, is not put off by this. Rather, he tells them he uses the opportunity to leverage a greater reward. He says, well, if 1,000 wasn't enough for that other witcher, it's not going to be enough for me either. I mean, that guy just ran off, so you clearly need to offer a larger reward. So he goes then to speak directly with King Foltest, who mostly blows him off and tells his advisors, explain the details, I'm out of here. The 2 advisors, Ostrid and Segalin, give a description and more details, such that though she comes out every night, she only leaves the castle during full moons. Geralt apparently knows all this already. He's told Foltest he's dealt with Striga before. For him, this is just due diligence, confirming expectations, making sure he's not being fed stories. So he needs to double check. As part of this investigative groundwork, he visits a miller, one of the only people who has survived an encounter with this Striga. After speaking to him, King Foltest reveals that he's been standing in the room all along, in plain clothes, in a hood, come to see Geralt again. Foltest, he's no fool. He reveals, hey guy, I know about this under the table offer. They're gonna get you to kill it and then say it was an accident or you at last resort, right? But what's actually gonna happen is then they're gonna say you disobeyed, and then I'm gonna hang you. So Geralt knows he's getting trapped between a rock and a hard place if he wants to get this job done. But he does want to get this job done. Foltest is not sure about Geralt, especially the part about Geralt killing 3 patrons in the bar just to get a meeting with him. But other than that, he seems to trust Geralt because he's conducted himself in a trustworthy manner, and because he believes, most importantly, that his daughter in this cursed form is suffering and can't wait. And not only that, who else is going to do it? Geralt enters the old palace, calmly sits down to prepare himself. Magic creates these grand possibilities, but it also creates hard and fast rules. The Striga won't emerge till midnight, and that's that. He drinks some elixirs to enhance his abilities, one of which gives him night vision. Almost immediately, the advisor Ostrid appears and tries to bribe Geralt to leave. Geralt accuses him of scheming to remove Foltest from the throne, which angers Ostrid, who draws his sword. Geralt does something we'll see him do a lot: hit people or creatures right in the temple. When he does it with a weapon, it's usually fatal, but this time he just punches him, good enough to knock him out. Then he ties him up and waits. When Ostrid awakens, he sees that he's tied up and realizes he's being used as bait. He confesses that, yes, I was trying to remove Foltest from the throne, but it's not just about politics, it's personal. He says he loved Ada, and that's the main thing going on here. But he's also a little contrite, wondering if maybe he's responsible for the curse. We learn through this that it's either him or Ada and Foltest's mother, Sansia, who disapproved of this incestuous relationship between her children. I mean, what mother would disapprove of that? But that doesn't mean she did a curse. So that's part of what we'll discuss. They exchange more blows before Geralt executes his planned strategy. Now that it's all, the Striga that is, worked up and frustrated, as angry as it's ever been, given the painful touch of silver and a foe in Geralt of Rivia who is unlike anything she's ever faced. So he uses a lot of strength to cast another unnamed spell, one that turns the Striga's intense hatred of Geralt in on itself like a mirror. And well, it really hates Geralt, so that reversal temporarily drives the beast away. He then runs to its sarcophagus, seals the stone lid closed with himself inside it, using a final spell, that is, and then he drinks an elixir and then just sleeps till morning next to the Striga's mother's dead body. When he wakes up, she's transformed. She's not in great shape, but she is a person, not a Striga, and that's what matters. But as he goes to check on her, there was still some Striga left in her after all, and she uses her claws/talons to slash his neck open really badly. She's normal physically, but after all this time as a Striga, her brain is not quite there. He knows he'll faint from blood loss if he doesn't actually act quickly, so he bites her neck. Okay, well, she passes out. Then he binds his own neck and does the same, passes out. Just 2 magically altered people, unconscious, side by side, bleeding from the neck. Since it's morning, it's known people can enter safely, and soon enough, people come in to find out what happened. They take the 2 unconscious people away and treat them. Geralt wakes up in the palace 2 days later. Velorad tells him the princess is fine, but of course, incapable for her age. She needs special care. And Geralt falls back asleep as Velorad asks him, in great confusion, why did you bite her on the neck? And that's it.
So great synopsis there by Aziz. Hopefully all of you in chat were following as I was. It was riveting. Of course, we would like to do some reactions now. And Michal, would you like to start with your reaction of the chapter? What was your overall thoughts?
Yeah. Well, first I want to say, would you call the synopsis riveting?
Yeah.
That's what I was going for. I couldn't quite say.
Yeah, I really like this story. I have some issues with it, but I think it's incredibly absorbing, and I think, you know, I'm always impressed by writers who can just plunge you into a world and explain where they have to and leave the rest to kind of just exist as like stuff that makes the world more like deeper and more lived in. And this story is incredible for that. I was, you know, telling Kyle and Aziz last night that I was just not sure how it was almost possible, but like this story could stand on its own and like not be part of a greater universe, because there is so much detail and so much kind of expectation, and Sapkowski approaches it with like, oh, well, of course the Witcher did this because that's just what Witchers do. Don't you know that? And I find it really wonderful. And I think it has, you know, a lot of the markers that make this story great. Really interesting themes, some really funny moments, some really poignant moments, like the quote I mentioned before. And yeah, overall, it's a very good entry into the story. And also, we live in 2020, so nobody's going to read it and be like, incest and fantasy?
Yeah, again, this was 1986.
Yeah.
It's safe to say that a lot of people are Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire fans, so we're kind of, you know, disinfected by what we saw there.
I know there is a moment where you're like, oh, right, in this world, people might be shocked about that.
Yeah.
I think one of the great things this chapter does is really, it's a great introduction into Geralt's personality, but also his professionalism. Like, he's a great observer. He's trying to view all the things that are going on, and they just thrust us right into this kingdom where all of these things are going on, and there's all this history and backstory that's already right there, right? And that's one of the things that is so unique about The Last Wish, I find, because it is a set of different short stories. There's quite a difference once we get into the novels. I like to say the novels, The Blood of Elves, and the continuation of, you know, the main story. But I just love so much of the Eastern European folklore that he includes. You know, we have some great stuff to talk about. Dracula later. Love that. That is, you know, some of my favorite stuff. We actually had a donation earlier from Thomas, and he said Snow White. There's a lot of really, really great references to fairy tales and how Sapkowski inverts them within these stories, and you know, inverts these tropes. So that I find that's another thing that's really interesting. But you know, the one thing, the things that really stand out for me is in the themes. You know, these dilemma and conflicts. We obviously see a king that is having a conflict within himself because he knows what's going on, and then the people are suffering as a result of that. So there's kind of this divide between the actual people of the kingdom and the king. So we often see that in medieval fantasies, and that's something that's, you know, there's a few really cool twists on that I found. And overall, like I said, I really enjoyed the themes. There's, you know, this kind of misunderstanding of magic and misunderstanding of witchers, and there's kind of this back and forth of people trying to understand each other and not quite understanding each other, and some great humor mixed in with that. So I think that this is kind of a it's not a complete chapter, but it's a great introduction into the world that Sapkowski builds with these short stories. Aziz, what's your reaction to this chapter?
Yeah, I would mostly echo y'all, maybe add a few other things, but yeah, I really liked it. It was obviously, for most of us, it was either you watched the show first or you read this short story first. And I like Michal, I'm surprised, I'm impressed how much is packed into this. It's only a 35-page story. It's actually one of the shortest ones out of the 6 or 7 short stories in this book, and then there's 6 or 7 in the next. It's basically tied for the shortest. And despite that, there's all this world building in there. There's a lot to dig into. It's also funny. It's irreverent. It's got this tragic element to it. This big, strong, tragic streak through it. But it also has these moments of just laugh out loud goofiness, or just irreverence, I think is probably the right word. And it gets kind of intense sometimes too. So I really like that. And like Michal and Kyle said, there's a lot of really powerful themes. A lot of them are recurring fantasy themes. Some of them are in-world themes, but some of them are very applicable to the real world. lots of progressive themes, lots of just political themes, lots of racial themes, lots of gender themes, things like that. Just lots of things that give us a lot to talk about that's applicable to the real world and situations that we may not have considered because, well, this is a different style world. It's got different races, different magic, different things are possible. And you get, like a lot of stories when you're just getting started, it's very often there's a few things that the author maybe decides that's not quite what they wanted to do. Maybe they changed their mind. It happens in A Song of Ice and Fire. It happens in The Wheel of Time. It happens in, maybe it doesn't happen in Lord of the Rings because Tolkien just did so much ahead of time, so much groundwork. But even there, you can find things where characters don't quite speak or behave the same way they do later. Maybe there's a few phrases that get thrown around that are suggested as typical that aren't really typical. And yeah, that's in this story too, but it's very minimal. So given that he just on a whim, almost on a whim, Sapkowski wrote this story and then exploded into a whole world for him over time. So given that, it's really impressive how little he had to change or pivot away from. Almost all the choices he made right away are maintained throughout the novels in terms of tone, in terms of characterization. There's a few exceptions, but yeah. So that's, as a first story, not only is it great, but as a first work in terms of a larger work, it's surprisingly representative of what's to come.
One thing too, as we go forward through the podcast of Surprise and we do these episodes, I kind of want to reference some of the stuff that happened in the TV show, just in the confusion in the timeline, and it is like, as Aziz said, there's 35-ish pages here, and it can get kind of confusing because it does jump around a lot. But that's what we're here for. We're here to help explain that. And like I said, as we get towards Blood of Elves, there's more cohesion and kind of this world building and all of that and moving the story forward. So this is kind of Sapkowski trying to tell us individual stories, and as Michal said, gardening and world building and just building that. It's almost like almost like a prologue. You know what I mean? Like it's getting into that, a prologue to the real Witcher story. So that's really interesting. Shall we? Actually, one thing before we move forward, thank you so much to Maura Lee for your donations in the chat. You're always so generous. We really, really appreciate that. Of course, we will split it 3 ways here. That's how we're doing it on the Witcher Pod of Surprise. As well, we have Tomas, who spoke about Snow White references. That's something that we're really going to get into with a grain of truth. So, and kind of the other stories.
Last Wish. I mean, not Last Wish. Yeah. Sorry. Lesser Evil.
Lesser Evil. That's one we were talking about with Renfrey and all of that, her backstory. So that's something that we're going to get into and something that we'll have in the podcast. And I saw one from Stacy as well. So thank you so much for tossing some coins to your not bitchers, but I shouldn't say that. That is one that Michal used in our private conversation the other day. But thank you for tossing a coin. That it really helps out the podcast and the channel, and we will use that appropriately as we go forward. Shall we get into some of the themes, Michal?
Yeah. Real quick, I saw a question that maybe should be addressed. A commenter, Macrophage, says it wasn't a whim that Sapkowski wanted to win that contest. He entered a writing contest kind of because his son suggested it. And so I refer to it as a whim. It's not technically a whim, sure, but he didn't. It wasn't a long planned out thing that he had planned for years and decided. So a whim is maybe putting it a little too simply, but it wasn't. It's compared it to Tolkien. That's kind of why I compared it to Tolkien, because Tolkien did this like unbelievable level of preparation. All this world building, a lot of which never got even used in the main stories, and then compare that to someone like Sapkowski, who's like, "I got this," and he did.
Yeah, he's the kind of author I hate, because clearly you're just so damn talented. Like short stories are really difficult to write, and for this is so well contained, and I'm sure he went through plenty of editing, because that's what writers do. But it's really, honestly, a remarkable first entry into a genre like this.
Yeah, it's such a great genre. Like, just overall, there's so many things to unpack, and it's really fun. I find it's not as heavy as a Song of Ice and Fire, but we will, maybe that's some kind of bonus content we can do. Some Song of Ice and Fire Witcher parallels later on. We've been discussing that. So just a little nugget there, mayhaps of what we were doing. Shall we get into some themes? There's lots of themes.
Yeah. So one of the, obviously we were talking about incest, and one of the major themes of the story is like love across boundaries. And those boundaries go from, we hear, Foltest being in love with his sister, which is obviously a boundary that he doesn't seem to have been too cognizant of, since apparently he was just like, yeah, I'm gonna marry her, blah, blah, blah. And everybody else was like, no. But, and then we even have the physical barrier of like the sarcophagus, which I think is a really interesting physical metaphor in a way, because you have, Foltest again talking to Geralt toward the end of their conversation. He asks if he wants to come basically and witness the fight, and see his daughter for the first time. And he gives a quite emotional speech about how he's never seen her. And this is obviously a being that he connects with in a paternal way, even though it's a monster, and his sister's daughter and his own daughter. And, there are a lot of reasons why I think a king approaching this from a purely political standpoint would not necessarily find use in a daughter like this. But he really does. And I think that's, really powerful. Another thing I wanted to talk about is one of my gripes with the story is that it kind of approaches women as vessels. There are no women who speak in this story. All the women are either dead or a monster, or the shadowy grandma figure who we don't know much about, and just kind of have these aspersions cast on her that she may have like literally created this beast. Ada is a silent vessel for her brother's love and for Ostrit's love. And we actually have no idea whether or not she reciprocated either of those feelings. Probably not Ostrit, but who knows? There's one line that suggests that she may have, that she had influence over Foltest, which might have meant that she loves him, or it also might have meant that she was making the best of a bad situation. But we have no interiority there. We just see her as a mummified corpse for a sec, and that's it. Then obviously we have the Striga, who is really interesting as like the moment where Geralt redirects kind of her own hatred, or the hatred that created her, back onto her, is fascinating, because that's really a point where we're talking about a creature who has been created by love, but also by hate, and by, resentment and anger, and has come to embody those things, and is revisiting those things on other people, to force the vessel to experience that, like I think it's used like a mirror or something that Geralt refers to it as. I find that really, really interesting, because how often do you kind of separate the malice associated with monsters with like as not being the monster's fault, and that's something that I think
something we see happen to Geralt quite often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. But she is, she doesn't have a personality. Like, even when she's a girl, she's just basically still a monster. And she's stupid and she pees the bed. And it's like, well, yeah.
Yeah, she's the brain of a 2-year-old still. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously
angry
we have
2-year-old.
Right. We obviously have the queen. We don't know much about her. But I will say that this is definitely something that Sapkowski, and I'll keep an eye on this as we continue discussing. He improves vastly on all of these kind of themes and the treatment of women, and the humanization of women, and giving them agency and all these things that are not, are maybe missing in this story as good as it is.
It's so interesting too, because we hear Velerad earlier. He's like, "Oh, like you want more money, and you're not interested in the princess at all." And Geralt's like, "Nah, I just want the money." And and we do have the theme of unusual parenthood going on here, right? I mean, we see that throughout the story, of course, a lot later on with Geralt, and that's kind of a theme here as well as these. And that kind of presents these dilemma and conflicts that we're seeing within this specific chapter.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's lots of a recurring theme for sure is that Geralt is presented with multiple stories about what's happened here. And the stories aren't necessarily, and I don't mean like one person believes the monster has wings and another one thinks it spits blood. I mean like moral dilemmas or conflict derived from being told different things about the ethics of a situation. For example, in this, when Velerad tells Geralt, and Velerad's just this kind of laid back, he seems like a decent guy. I mean, maybe not laid back isn't the right word, but he's a Castellan, but he's a little bit, he's definitely got like a happy side to him, even though he's describing all these awful things.
Like putting people's heads on pikes.
Yeah, right. And just like tying criminals up in front of the palace to like feed the Striga so it doesn't go kill someone, that they actually care about. But he also just assumes that the incest is the reason this beast has been created. They're just like, oh, it's clearly because of the incest. That's why the Striga happened. And that's part of what Geralt suspects Ostrit is going to do, is to use this. Oh, look, the king's behavior brought all this on the realm, and it's a reason to overthrow him. So there's a lot of politics in play there. And so Geralt, over time, it's a recurring theme that he navigates these situations particularly well. He understands he's very cynical. He's older than he seems, which is referenced in this story. Foltest brings that up for just like 2 seconds. And so he has a lot of experience with contract negotiation. You shouldn't see him as a greedy guy. It almost comes off like I could see someone reading this and think, oh, he's just all about the money. But really, you should think of him as like an artist who's used to being screwed out of money for something they've done. Like they do the work.
He's not doing this for exposure.
And he's providing a service he's providing a service to the public, and they still treat him like this. So it's like, what?
So he's used to getting screwed over. So that's why he's so tight about the money here. He's not like, oh, it's all about the cash. That's an easy, perhaps, line of thinking to fall into. That is, if you feel that way now, you would eventually read yourself out of that. But I'll just say it right now. So it's also a recurring theme that both of them have touched on a little bit, that Witchers are not widely trusted, even though they kill monsters that are attacking people. And even though Geralt himself seems to be a stand-up guy, what we learn is that not all Witchers are like Geralt, and not all of them are as decent as him, and they're just people. But also, it's mostly a lot of it's about their appearance, and that they're magically altered, and that they're kind of loners, and that there's a lot of rumors about them. So you never know. Anytime he goes somewhere, you never know how he's going to be treated, whether they'll be like, oh, we really need you, or whether they're like, get the hell out of here, Witcher. Sometimes he'll ride up to a settlement and they'll just throw rocks at him, and he has to ride on to the next place. So this is his life. So he's not treated well on a regular basis. So this is a little why he's maybe a little off-putting to people, or standoffish. But in this story, it's a slightly different, because he's not treated too badly for being a Witcher. In fact, Velerad seems to treat him positively for that. And not too many, it doesn't seem to come up much. He's treated badly in that opening scene in the bar, because he's Rivian. Now, there's more to do with that, but Temeria and Rivia are not far from each other. And so it makes sense that they would have had some border clashes, or there'd be some racism between, or at least prejudice between these nations. And that's really what's at play here. It's his accent that and maybe his style of dress that gets them. So that's a little bit of a quirk there.
It's really interesting too, Aziz, because of the final outcome. It's like, to kill or not to kill. Mm-hmm. He puts himself in an incredibly difficult situation, a dangerous one where he could die. And we don't usually see this with monster stories. So this one is really unique, where he he's trying not to kill this monster where he could, and he's trying to make this situation work. And I found that really interesting. So this like to kill or not to kill, we see this usually fights till the death, right? I mean, later on in other stories. So that's what's really interesting about this specific story and these prejudice towards Witchers especially, and the treatment of monsters, because Geralt is more understanding of monsters themselves because he's treated like one. So yeah.
He doesn't want to kill anything that's intelligent. He doesn't just kill monsters because, and there has to be a good reason. And the more intelligent they are, the less likely he's going to kill them. But it's not, and there's no rule. There's no like hard and it's a constant figuring out of where the line is, and each circumstance has to be judged differently. That's fascinating because that's so applicable to the real world, like with animal species and things like that, and plants and all that, and just how we treat criminals and how we treat at-risk everything. It just has so much application to modern society.
Michal, you had a point that you wanted to touch on?
Yeah, I find it really interesting that, like, we do get this incredibly careful treatment of the Striga from Geralt. But the opening scene is just him slaughtering 3 guys who were basically just like rude to him. I'm like, I'm not saying that they were good guys, but also it definitely strikes me as something that even in the later stories in this book, Geralt would not necessarily have done. I think in A Question of Price, he talks to Calanthe about how, like, I'm not just here to kill people you don't like, So
I'm not
Geralt,
here to
like,
be your bodyguard.
yeah, Geralt killing 3 people to get the king's attention doesn't really strike me as something that follows through with his personality. But it does make an interesting contrast within the context of this story, in terms of kind of what he's willing to do, and I guess, a lot of things being a question of how economical they are, and how like what the desired effect is, right? So if the desired effect is to get the attention of the king, then I guess this version of Geralt, it's worth it to kill these guys. If the desired effect is to save this girl, then it's worth it to take that risk.
He flips it on us. You would figure that in both of these situations, the outcome would be flipped, where he doesn't kill people and he kills a monster. So that it's really interesting how we have different outcomes flipped. Like we think that he's going to kill a monster in the end, and then he ends up killing these people instead. So I found that really interesting.
And then he almost kills her as a girl.
He bites her.
He has the biter. So there's a lot of these different characters around, and a lot of people pulling at him in different directions. There's Foltest, there's Ostrit, there's Velerad, and there's just himself. I mean, he wants to do the job right. He has his own code, something that develops over several short stories, and the main novels is him discussing and sometimes struggling with his own code. He doesn't, and that. If you're really trying to make sense of him killing these 3 bar patrons, which I agree with Michal, doesn't necessarily fit with his personality later, but you can make it work if you squint a little by imagining that we see him at high points, at low points throughout his life and these different stories, and he definitely loses his sense of his ethics in certain ways at a certain point. I'm not saying he turns into a bad guy or something, but like all people, he sometimes struggles with his own sense of self, his own sense of code, and his own what's right, what's this all worth. And it's different for him because he's very isolated and lonely, and there's hardly anyone like him, etc. So that's another recurring theme, is Geralt dealing with himself and realizing that the world, he has to kind of put himself above things because the world is not very nice to him.
The conflict with the human heart is the best conflict, Aziz.
Oh yeah.
You spoke about struggles. I found that really interesting because there is this, struggle and misunderstanding magic, and there's this superstition going on. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because that's a pretty big theme in this chapter.
Yeah, let's do that. The talking about magic, or which way should we go? Influences. Where should we start here?
I mean, magic users and their culture and the society.
Oh
yeah.
Great point. Okay, yeah. The magic is very interesting in this world. It's considering superstition in a world that actually has real magic is an entirely different bag. But it still happens. You see in this scene where Ostrit very foolishly pulls his sword on Geralt, and Geralt you can almost see him kind of chuckling internally, like this guy has no idea what he's getting into. And that's part of that's another recurring theme is Witchers. People think the rumors of Witchers are exaggerated. They can't really be that good at fighting, and this guy thinks he's protected from Geralt's magic by what's called a turtle stone. And turtle stones don't do much at all of anything, but it's apparently a commonly held belief that they're prevention against magic. And this is also a recurring theme that Geralt has to cut through superstition and belief in things that aren't really accurate, rumor. But he, as part of his training and part of Witcher training, they're very, very well read and learned on various types of monsters, and that's certainly a recurring theme as we see in this story. He's fought Striga before, but to Kyle's greater point here, there are sorcerers in this world, and Witchers only have a small bit of magic. They have, which is, a little bit of magic is a lot compared to somebody that has none. But there's people that can create monsters. There's people that can create weather and turn into monsters and things like that. There is pretty powerful magic in this world, and Geralt's is more of the basic combat magic. It helps him deal with these monsters, etc. But it isn't this grand epic scale thing. But that does exist in this world, and within these cultures, certain realms don't like sorcerers. Certain ones do. Certain sorcerers and witchers don't really get along that well. Witchers are kind of on the bottom of this social magic user ladder. And whereas sorceresses are often found right at the right hand of kings and queens, advising them, helping write policy, doing court intrigue, things like that. Whereas Witchers are really more boots on the ground. Geralt is often broke. That's another recurring theme. He has no money sometimes. Whereas some of these sorcerers and magic users, just their means to make money is almost limitless. I mean, they're not absurdly filthy.
Serving as court mages, they're in these dynastic environments, right?
Yeah, so they just have money's not a problem. Let's put it this way: money's not a problem for them. They don't find themselves like, hey, can someone buy me dinner? That literally happens.
I'm not gonna say it's because the wizards and sorceresses are unionized and the Witchers aren't. But I'm not going to say that.
It's true. They are unionized. It's very true.
The Witchers is kind of like, okay, you got your Witcher training. Congratulations, you survived. Go out into the world and kill monsters. Your income is your own responsibility. Whereas as we're going to learn later, magic as a capital M magic and its practitioners are. They have a much higher opinion of themselves and what they do, and correspondingly, people both hate them and also have to give them that respect in order to get what they need from those people. And they don't need to do that from the Witchers. What you were saying about Witchers being kind of underestimated, Aziz, is interesting because I think people underestimate them only when it suits them. It definitely suits everyone to be and this is not in this story, but it becomes a major touch point. Witchers have no feelings. Witchers get their humanity burned out of them, and then and they're happy to believe that. But if they're going up to fight against one, it's they can't be that good. That can't be true. It's deeply human in that way. I just did want to point out another inconsistency that's sort of, I think, a sign of Sapkowski's early conception of the magic, which is the use of the term knowing ones that gets just tossed around frequently throughout the story to the point that you would think that this is just what witches and wizards and magic people are called. But that term, as far as I know, never shows up again.
Yeah, it seems to be a catch-all for sorcerers, many kind of magician, druids, witchers. But yeah, I think he got rid of that. I agree. I don't think it comes up again.
There is this factionalism going on. So there is this kind of divide in how people see magic users and how people see kings and witchers. So there's a lot of that going on. Yet Geralt is you know, like as we see people judging Witchers, he's still great at navigating conversations, even though he doesn't have a lot of peers. And this is because of how much he's experienced in the world. And that's really, you know, why Geralt is such an interesting character.
Yeah, he's very cynical, but he's also experienced.
Speaking to what Michal said, you know, they view Witchers as these kind of emotionless husks, but we see this great warmth on the inside of Geralt. You know, I mean, just in this situation alone and what happens in the fight later on in the trailer, like Geralt doesn't have to go to those lengths, and he still does. And look at what happens. He almost dies. So he goes to great lengths to try to solve this situation for humans. So I found that was an interesting theme that was prevalent throughout the chapter.
And he's willing to do it. Like he doesn't even really question that he's going to attempt to break the curse. You know, he wants to make sure he'll get paid if he breaks the curse, but he doesn't go like, you know, he doesn't argue them down and be like, okay, well, if it's 3,000 orens, if she's alive, then like I'm gonna kill her and give me 1,000. You know. Like he's not interested in the games that the courtiers and Ostrad are playing, you know, trying to pay him off in exchange for killing the Striga. He's a really he's already very layered and also very magnetic. This is just the first time that we see something I'm gonna continually point out, which is everybody like who meets Geralt sitting back and being like, "Sir, I feel like I can tell you everything," and just like spilling their guts to this guy they don't know, which is a literary trope, but also, you know, I think something that speaks very well to the character as he gains allies and friends through the series.
Yaskier. Because there's a lot of that going on, him being a psychiatrist for him.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is really true. It's so layered because he's, as much as we praise his ability to navigate these political situations, he's not good with relationships, personal relationships, which makes sense because he's a loner and doesn't have peers. He's, you know, old beyond his years, even though he looks young, but he does have this magnanimity. He does have this magnetic personality. He does have this, and he's also practiced. He uses the technique that we see used in lots of like cop shows where just let him talk. Don't say anything. Just sit there and let them spill. They'll just get nervous and start talking. Just, you know, let that. And Geralt is a master of that. He just sits people, and it's a double whammy because not only do people not like silence, so they start talking, but he's the kind of person that people like to open up to because he's just got that trustworthy appearance, and that the way he carries himself is, yeah, I feel like I can trust this guy. Maybe not in a relationship, but he'll get this job done.
It's part of the reason why the fame of Geralt. We got to remember that Geralt is seen as probably the most famous and successful Witcher, and it's something that's interesting that's presented too. Like, you know, with the whole contract negotiation thing, we see the other kind of Witcher split town, but he's like trying to fix this, and there's this, even though Geralt doesn't care that much about the public perception of him, he's still there trying to, you know, fix the situation. And it shows that he does care about the perception of the Witcher Guild as a whole. So I find that really interesting, kind of that contrast going on there as well.
That's a good point.
Yeah, he really doesn't. And this is consistent. He almost never cares what people think of him. Certain people he comes to care about. But he is very protective of the idea of Witchers, I think. And
which we see with Papa Vesemir later on.
Yeah.
Not all the other Witchers are as protective of that as we see.
Lambert. So we got a couple other donations I'd like to shout out in chat. I'm just getting here back here. Anime lover Nicole, thank you very much. Morally again, my goodness, thank you so much,
Thanks, Maura.
And Shadow Fox, she says, just because I love listening to you guys chat, we really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Shall we?
Sorry. Yeah, also, there's a comment from Macrophage in the chat who mentions that something I noticed too, which is that Velerad is like, 20 years ago we didn't need Witchers, and that definitely is a contrast because to what we see later, it definitely seems like a one of those charming inconsistencies, you know, in the early drafts.
There's really two unique sides to Valorant. He's really extreme.
Well,
That's
he
a
is
good, that is a good
also,
point. Yeah.
yeah, just to point out, like, he, you know, the way he talks about, like, Ada's death, he's just like, oh, well, thank goodness she didn't live. It's like, okay, sorry, she was what, like 15 when, you know, like, this is just like, ugh. I mean, he seems to be a genial fellow among fellows, but not necessarily like somebody who cares too much about those under him in the hierarchy.
He's a lot nicer than Ostrich, that's for sure.
He lacks nuance. Yeah, he's better than Ostrich. He just lacks nuance. Yeah, that's a good point. And to what you from that comment, it's true. Yeah, the idea that Witchers are just now being needed is definitely off from the rest of the world building that we get later. It's more of that they're less needed. That need is falling off. I mean, they're still needed, but yeah, the less and less monsters in the world. But anyway, but that's something that comes up later. We'll get to that.
So as far as all the recurring themes, I think we touched on most of them there. Did anybody have anything that we want out, or we want to get to the character section?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the characters. Yeah.
Yeah. Where do we want to start? Do we want to talk about Geralt's brutality? We talked.
I feel like we covered Geralt a bit already, but
I think we should probably.
Let's talk about Foltest a little. Do you have anything to say about Foltest, Michal?
Just that I think he's a good example of the surprises that Sapkowski is capable of seeding into his stories, because, you know, you do initially meet Foltest and you think he's like, you know, first of all, we don't have a very high opinion of him in general because he slept with his sister, but also like he doesn't seem like somebody who is logical. You know, the way Valorant portrays him is just like, oh, the king is just determined on this whim of having his daughter, which is impossible, and so everybody can just die and it doesn't matter as long as he gets what he wants. You know, hurt one hair on I think Foltest even says, like, if you hurt one hair on her head, I'm going to chop off your head, in that early scene. And, you know, when there's something that's kind of automatically useful in having a royal character or a character of importance come in disguise and then reveal themselves, because I think that immediately strips away a lot of pretension. And it's actually interesting to me because the merchant or shoemaker or something or whatever that Geralt is trying to talk to, who survived the Striga attack, is terrified. And I'm actually wondering, like, was he terrified because he's talking about the Striga or talking to the Witcher, or is it because he knows the king is right there?
That's a good point. I never thought of that.
Yeah. So I think, I really think Foltest is a really interesting twist on that, because that fatherly love that he has seems to be incredibly genuine and not...
Well, he's like, letting his people die because of it. So.
That's true. That's true. It's really complicated, right? Like, he doesn't really seem to give a shit. Like, okay, well, I have my new palette, so like, whatevs. But yeah, it's a very interesting contrast and blend of taking advantage of people lower than him on the social scale, while also being very protective of a being who is, you know, ultimately innocent. And he is sort of, even if it's not like, even if the Striga didn't come about because of the incest or wasn't created by the incest, I think he's aware that he bears a certain degree of responsibility. If he does
feel guilt.
Yeah, exactly. So he's a really interesting, I think, version of nobility. Especially in this world that has so many kings, and there's just like so much that we get a lot of different kinds of aristocracy in the Witcher world, and he's a really interesting introduction to that.
Yeah, the number of kingdoms in this world is large. It's if I could make another, I'll try not to make too many Game of Thrones references, but I'll make one here, which is that if you picture before there were 7 kingdoms and there was just there's a lot more. Individual, petty kingdoms. That's the right term. So it's a little bit like that, but it's also more modern. It's not people call it medieval. That's probably not quite right. It's probably more accurately Gothic. Geralt has like a little miniature hourglass in this one, and there's definitely a little bit more tech with machines, and the swords are a little nicer, and the landscape is more lawful. There's more there's banks and police forces and things like that. They're not, there's not guns, but there's it's the society has come a little farther, we'll say, rather than being kind of stuck as some of these other fantasy.
We didn't see that much progress in the Song of Ice and Fire. They became stuck for a while.
They're permanently stuck. Yeah, pretty much.
Democracy.
So I think that's really interesting. And going back to Foltest, one thing I think about him is that he's sort of a different version of something that Geralt can a little bit sympathize with, and vice versa, which is that when you're a king, or when you're a witcher, or when you're any sort of really unusual part of society, even a really powerful part of society, you have less freedom with your relationships. Not necessarily freedom, but less people that are out there that will be a match for you. And that's part of why there's these recurring themes of incest among nobility, because they don't go out and play with the common kids. They're isolated from other relationships. They don't have these other friendships. They're not out there playing in the neighborhood. And so that's and Geralt can kind of understand that. He doesn't necessarily like, oh, I understand incest, but he I think on some level he understands that Foltest's sister was the only person that could ever understand him truly, and it wouldn't be an arranged marriage. And he doesn't have these are one of those rare things where a king and a queen have fewer choices than a common person.
The idea of having peers, I think, as somebody with power, whatever kind of power that is, with a singular kind of power, is people like that don't usually have peers. And I agree. It's really interesting to see kind of the desire for that, like which is a very relatable desire that I don't think we would attribute to people with a ton of power, but
which is why we see power hungry Ostrich. We see his jealousy, and that's a part of the big reason why this curse was kind of spoken into existence with these tense feelings that were happening, right? Like there was this jealousy going on, and that kind of was a big factor into some of why this happened. That was really
that's a great point. And one last thing on that as well, the idea that Foltest also doesn't have any other kids. He never had a child elsewhere. So this is his sister's not only the only person he ever loved. This child of his that he's never met is his only child. So he has it's a double whammy there, because he feels for his sister that he lost and his own guilt, but he also, that's his child, and he feels responsible in a way that's kind of impossible to really fully wrap your head around, because it's so impossible from real world perspective.
Absolutely. So I think maybe we should talk about Ostrich next, because he kind of has a fairly big role. I know Michal has some very interesting points about Ostrich and Ada to speak about.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we wrote in the doc, that his love of Ada is part of his character, and I'm more like, well, his love at Ada.
in the document I'm reading it, and she struck out of.
Yeah.
Love at Ada.
And again, it's sort of like look, we don't know. It is possible that maybe they were very close friends as children, or we don't know. But it doesn't strike me as the type of thing where Ostrich particularly cared what Ada thought. It was more like I want you to be mine, like I'm in love with you and no one else can play with you except me. And like that obviously persists.
Your greater point of women being vessels.
Exactly. Yeah. And it persists obviously for 14 years. And it just doesn't, I mean, I think something else that's unusual is, Geralt's unabashedly putting Ostrich on the altar to be slaughtered here. watching. And I mean, like it's one of the most cold-blooded things that Geralt does, I think, in the entire series. And and I want to think that he's like, this guy deserves it. Like, you know, like he's not just using a random sack of meat. You know, he is using this person
like one.
Right, exactly. So I want to use that as evidence that Ostrid is not the greatest dude, but I admit that that's a logical implication that might not be in the text.
What one song that could kind of describe Ostrid's love for Ada? I want you to want me. I need you to need me. That's kind of what's going on there.
Yeah, but I mean, possessiveness is an important.
Man-eater.
He's a man-eater.
Well, I do want to just say, like, possessiveness is an important idea in relationships going forward. And, you know, the healthy and positive relationships that we see have virtually no possessiveness to them. Because I think a lot of the time in fiction and in real life, protectiveness or possessiveness is substituted for protectiveness. So it's like, I'm protecting you, but really I just want you to be mine. That is actually something that has quite a clear distinction in the Witcher stories with the positive relationships we see. And it's interesting that we start with a pretty, in my opinion, clear, like, possessive and non-protective relationship, because I mean, I don't know if, like, assuming that he is responsible, Ostrid, for the curse, Ada might not have died if she hadn't been forced to give birth to a literal monster. You know, like, she might have, because she was a young girl in childbirth, but, like, she also might have lived. And so basically it's all Ostrid's fault, and he's bad.
which is why it's so interesting when Geralt comes in, because one thing he's really good at is being honest.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's a pretty good communicator. Without Geralt in that situation, they might have still had this thing going on forever. You know what I mean? So he's kind of like that equalizer in this situation.
Yeah, he brought in the outside consultant to things over here, literally cut through, but not cut through, because he didn't cut anyone with his sword. Except those three guys in the bar.
And then for his crew later on.
Yeah. Plenty of people later, but yeah.
Oh God, can you just imagine, like, honey, I'm going out for a drink. Oh, you know what, dude? You've had a really long day. You brought in the harvest. Like, yeah, go enjoy a drink. Oh, okay. He got killed by a witch. Oh, man.
Geralt, you're all bloody.
You insulted the wrong Rivian.
Oh, man.
The fact that we're laughing about bloody murder is pretty shit.
Well, so, I think we covered Valorad. Do we have anything to say about Ada? Should we talk about the duck? Because it's Ada. It's confusing because Ada is the name of the daughter and the wife, and the sister wife. So she's like Ada Junior and Ada Senior. So that gets a little confusing. But
there is some spoilers for the daughter later. We perhaps should.
We'll save that. We'll talk about her fate at another time.
All I can say is good luck.
Yeah, good luck. Good luck to her.
If you want to go ahead, Aziz, go ahead.
Oh, that's all I have for that. Yeah,
that's all we have for that.
We'll save some of the later Ada stuff, because that is a little spoilery.
I guess we could, one big section that we do have is influences. We can start to get into that. Really, the vampire myth and the Striga and all that. That's a really interesting section. And I know a lot of people on the channel have been talking about bestiary videos and stuff like that. So let's get into that.
Let's do this is one of the great things about the Witcher novels, is how much real world influence there is from mythological traditions. And I don't mean like myths like, Greek gods and things like that. I mean like Eastern European and vampire myths, Western European vampire myths, all over Europe, and not just Europe, but mostly European. For example, let's just start with the word Striga and the name Striga. There's a version of this creature in all over Eastern Europe, and in lots of Central Europe, and there's similar words. For example, Strega in Italian means witch, and there's a similar word in French and in Venetian. The word strigex, which I don't know how to say this properly, it's Greek. It's a bird of ill omen, like a bat / owl. The Latin for owl is strix, and that's like specifically a screech owl. Romanian astriga means to scream, and the striga screams very loudly. Geralt repeatedly, like really loudly yells,
like a banshee.
Yeah, at one point,
but not like I did it.
Yeah, at one point, Geralt notes that it like cracks the plaster when the Striga gets particularly mad, and the English translation of Striga is poltergeist. There you go, the screaming and all that. So it's really it all connects, and there's a lot of ancient tradition in this, and so Sapkowski, as a Polish man, probably heard some of these stories as a kid, different versions of them. There's probably fairy tales and stories that are only in Polish that we've never heard of and probably never will heard of. But there are certainly going to be influences of this sort in there. And like Kyle has alluded to, there is a lot of very, very direct references to Dracula. And before I get into that, we've noticed, and we're not the first, but we may notice some new ones. But generally speaking, every Witcher short story seems to have a parallel to one famous existing story from
especially the short stories.
Yeah, from the human world. Like Snow White was mentioned as a strong parallel to the void. Which one? The Lesser Evil, and of course, Reign of Truth, and is Beauty and the Beast. We have. A Little Sacrifice is The Little Mermaid. we have a
little bit of a Moby Dick situation going on later on in the Sword of Destiny.
That's true. So it's really cool how he likes to draw on these, but he changes them. He borrows some elements from them, and of course, this is a common thing for writers to do. So it's really part of an ongoing tradition of borrowing and changing, but using things from the real world. And it's interesting to talk about real world when we're talking about Striga and poltergeist and things like that. But these are based on real world legends. So let's talk a little bit about that specifically as it pertains to Dracula. What's interesting is how traits of Dracula's are split apart. Some of them are given to the Striga, and some of them are given to Geralt. For example, consider that Dracula can go out in daylight without suffering. Unlike a lot of vampires, it's like sunlight just makes them burn. But he didn't have his powers in the day. And that's kind of like what's happening here. The Striga at night, she only comes out at night. And if they can keep her out in the day, she loses all her powers. Now, that's more of a permanent thing, but it's a similar concept. The way they beat Dracula in the original Bram Stoker novels is, well, they deny him his resting places. He goes to England. That's part of the plot. Is he works with Jonathan Harker to go to England, and he makes 50 coffins, and they all contain soil from Transylvania and all this, and so they figure out that destroying these is the way to defeat him. So they destroy all his coffins and put like holy wafers inside. So there's like a religious thing going on. So that's kind of similar to what Geralt does. He goes to this sarcophagus, and instead of destroying it or sealing it shut from the outside, he gets inside it and crosses his arms as he lies down. That really gets me. It says that he crosses his arms, and then he sleeps until daylight.
He's got his little timer.
And of course, one of the biggest nods of all is that he bites her neck after she slashes his neck open. And but just picture it. He comes out of this coffin in the morning, impossibly old, white-haired, and then bites a girl's neck. I mean, like, hello.
Because after Dracula feeds, goes back to sleep, and that's kind of what, after Geralt almost dies, he just goes back to sleep after he's asked the question.
That's true. Also, in Dracula, he's very wary of letting people know how strong and fast he is. He controls his movements and moves very deliberately because he's extremely fast and strong and doesn't want people to see that. He's like to be like, what the hell? That guy just moved like lightning. And when Geralt takes his elixirs and he's talking to Ostrit, he's moving really slowly, and he doesn't want Ostrit to see how fast he can move. And he's like, he doesn't want the light. There's like even the light of the stars is too bright for him because he drinks this stuff that makes his eyes really sensitive, and Ostrich's voice is really loud. And so because he's all prepared for this. So these are all very similar to, these are all Dracula story beats, sort of, well, not story beats, but details. Two more points here. In Dracula, when he's killed, when Dracula is finally defeated, one of the gang that's helping beat Dracula is a guy named Quincy, and Quincy is killed in this final showdown with Dracula. Mina marries Jonathan. Mina Harker marries Jonathan Harker, and they have a child 7 years later. And that child they name Quincy. So it's kind of like rising again, you know. And then finally, this is even more obscure. When Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, it's not quite sure what happened, but there was a first part that was cut out, like a chapter 1 that was either written separately or that was edited out. It's not clear what happened. But there was another story called Dracula's Guest that was a kind of a prequel, and it's apparently Jonathan Harker traveling to Transylvania, getting, you know, as Dracula's beginning his plans to move to England or to settle in England. And as he's traveling there, there's a nasty snowstorm, and weird stuff happens, and he's attacked by one of Dracula's 3 women, like female vampires that hangs out with him, and a wolf comes and sits on top of Jonathan Harker and just lays on top of him and protects him and keeps him warm. So you have a wolf. So you have a wolf here, and of course, when does this take place? On Walpurgis Night, which is May Day, which is Beltane, which is what's happening. Beltane is happening on the Beltane Festival is happening during this short story, and Beltane also happens to be when Ciri and Yennefer are born. Not the same Beltane, but years apart. So that's all just a whole fire hose of Dracula.
And then there's the whole Curse of the Black Sun thing, which is related to both of them. So that's
yeah. So this is going to be a recurring theme. So we could really just go off on this for a while, but if we're good, we'll keep it. One thing I do want to reference is the moon. Oh yeah.
In symbolism is often linked to fertility and what's going on there. But one thing I found really interesting is predators like wolves. They often hunt at night. And Geralt is named the White Wolf. So, monsters and animals are predatory. And we've seen a lot of that happen in human culture because humans are active during the day. So animals are more scared and they hunt at night and do all of that. So that's something that's really interesting I found about that. And the moon is always symbolic for cycles. Of course, we talk about the 7-year cycles and when the Striga comes out to hunt and all of that. So that is something that is symbolic throughout the story that is referenced as well.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also important to know when we're talking about stories, this is something that's very, very important. Honestly, one of the most important things in the Witcher books is the connection to stories. And, you know, obviously as the books go on, they depart somewhat from, kind of following the templates of other fairy tales or subverting fairy tales, but they become their own kind of fairy tales, and that relationship between myth and story and belief and what actually happened is something that Sapkowski is deeply interested in a really fascinating way. So I don't think it's accidental that we can. I don't know if it's intentional, but I also don't think it's an accident that we can connect so much to another story, you know, in this case Dracula, but basically just as you're reading, keep an eye on the way he views his own story as a story, both in a meta sense and within the world, because that's a really interesting thing. And honestly, one of the elements that I love the series, but that's one of the things that elevates it to basically Game of Thrones level writing for me, because it is so considered and intellectual and unexpected and interesting at the same time. Can I say enough superlatives? It's really good. I like
it. Would you like to start us off with the bestiary, Cal?
Yeah.
Sure. Shall I read this?
We have some quote that we have some quoting.
Okay. Her Royal Highness, the cursed royal bastard, is 4 cubits high, shaped like a barrel of beer, has a maw which stretches from ear to ear and is full of dagger-like teeth, has red eyes and a red mop of hair. Her paws, with claws like a wildcat's, hang down to the ground. I'm surprised we haven't sent her likeness to friendly courts. The princess, plague choke her, is 14. Time to think of giving her hand to a prince in marriage.
So that's Velerad. So this is part of why we think Velerad is funny, because he says stuff like that. He's like, yeah, clearly, like this is clearly what we have to do, right? Like he's just Velerad is so.
Velerad's like, hi, I'm Velerad. I have opinions.
Yeah, he's just like, this is the world we live in. We're blah blah blah. So that's not an inaccurate description. And then we also get this description, which comes from Geralt looking at the bite marks on the miller who got away from him and kind of like, let's judge these bite marks here.
Yeah, so that says, the Striga could open her jaws impressively wide and had extremely sharp teeth, including very long upper fangs. Vampire. 4 of them, 2 on each side. Her claws were sharper than a wildcat's, but less curved. So she's dangerous.
There's that other moment where she opens her mouth as if she's proud of her teeth.
Yeah, that's a great description. Yeah. And so, like, it's almost like a perverse version of a kid being like, "Look, I have a tooth," you know.
Wow, that's true. So, in all these different traditions of Striga, it looks like, you know, Kafkowski couldn't just pick one. There's so many types of Striga. Given we just talked about the versions from Italy and Romania and all Poland. I'm sure there's just various ones, some of which go back farther than these nations, exist. So he just kind of chose his own version. And maybe it's kind of a mashup of something, but it's very important to note that the incest part is not something I could find in any of my research. That's something that Sapkowski added to this. Usually it's traditionally it's created by someone who dies through suicide, or someone who dies through what's the other way? Through a couple of other ways that are really obscure, like dying from blood loss. I forget exactly, but there's a lot of really strange, obscure ways that are legendary from Earth. And so I suppose what Sapkowski's doing is just kind of mashing a lot of that together and taking some of those options, but also adding his own stuff to it. As we learned, the curse is almost certainly how it was created, but it's also it's a picky eater. The heart and liver are very important pieces of nutrition. Sometimes it eats more, sometimes it eats less. That's actually a historical reference to the heart and liver could be dried up and ground and put into a potion to make love potions back in the day. And this is really cruel. The legend goes that you take a small child and bury them alive with food just out of reach, so that they would be struggling to reach that food and they would die in that state. And so that the thinking was that they would die in their state of death existed with this sense of longing, that they were desperately trying to get this thing. And so taking their heart and liver would maintain those feelings. And so that's where you put that into a potion, and anyone who drinks it has that same longing for the person that gave it to them. So this is really like, this heart and liver thing gets really dark if you really research it. So I'm like, whoa, what have I gotten into? So yeah, so that's really that's interesting how that all comes from the Striga. I mean, had you guys heard of Striga before? I hadn't. That word was completely new to me before The Witcher.
I heard Strigoi in a vampire tale called The Strain, which some may have heard of, which was an interesting show, and people become infected by this kind of worm parasite, which is pretty interesting.
Okay.
And also gross.
It's not interesting at the current time, sorry.
Yeah, right. That's not,
I'm actively disinterested.
God damn. I totally didn't mean it that way. Yeah.
But yeah, I guess Dracula is a Strigoi mort. I think that's one term that's thrown like so even Dracula is one of those.
Yeah, well, something I was thinking about, and I think I mentioned this to you, Aziz, possibly also Kyle. We've talked a bit. I can't remember when I said what, but it's interesting to me that in kind of like American mythology, we seem to divide stuff up in ways that they aren't necessarily divided in the original, Eastern European or Eastern versions. Sorry, somebody's ringing my doorbell. So, in terms of like a vampire being associated with like bats, but also with wolves, and also with, like the mythological lines are just a lot messier. And I feel like by the time we got them to America, we were like, no. We need the wolves to be the werewolves, and we need the bats to be the vampires, and we need the undead to be the zombies, and the witches to be the brooms. And like, I find it very interesting when you go back and think about these things, how many connections there are between the legends, and how you can't necessarily, I mean, sometimes you can, but you can't always just be like, this is definitively one creature or another.
Which is why it's funny that Geralt mentions so many different ones.
And we'll see that in the next story, right? He's like, wait, are you this? No. Are you this?
He's just like naming all the different types of vampires. Are you that?
Like pulling out his dictionary, like, wait a second. Okay.
She's like, almost, colder, warmer.
I'm prettier than those.
Yeah, that's really funny.
Okay, should we talk about lore? Like the
Okay. I briefly mentioned cycles and moons and magical influence. We can start to go with some of the signs.
Yeah, the moon obviously is big here because of the timing of when the Striga is active and not. But there's little tidbits. It's interesting that Geralt uses more magic probably in this story than he does in maybe any other story. I think maybe Sapkowski decided to scale back a little bit of his magic use. But he uses the sign of Ard, which is kind of like force pushing, the sign of Erden, which is how he seals himself in a sarcophagus. He uses the sign of
trap. Yeah,
it's kind of like a trap. Yeah, and a sign of Axii, which is kind of like a calming mind. It's almost like Jedi mind trick, but also can be used just for calming. And that thing he does to turn the fear in on itself, which was the most interesting one. That one doesn't ever get used again. And it doesn't have a name, but it's really, really interesting. And Michal, I'm glad you talked about that one earlier, but I should have mentioned that I put a quote for it here.
Oh, so, yeah.
Why don't you read that?
Yeah. The Witcher shivered at the memory of taking on that evil to redirect it, as if in a mirror against the monster. Never before had he come across such a concentration of hatred and murderous frenzy, not even from basilisks who enjoyed a ferocious reputation for it.
Let me just say one more thing, and then I'll toss it over to you guys. I tried to research the concept of the cock crowing 3 times as like a symbolic moment, but all I found was just relentless references to the Bible story of Daniel and the cock crowing before he lied 3 times or something like that about the coming of Jesus, something like that. That's all I could find. So I don't know if that's referenced. Obviously, Sapkowski would have been.
What about the horn blowing 3 times for the White Walkers in the other?
So what did you guys think of that? The way it's used and just all that. I just wanted to kind of detail it so people knew what was going on. But as far as getting into its purpose and all that, I don't have a whole lot to say about that.
No, neither do I.
Just that it's a really interesting idea, and I'm sort of surprised he doesn't use it again, because it does stand out as kind of like a thematic moment in the story. I think it's very effective, because it sort of it goes from this fight that's like pretty hard and brutal to this emotional plane, and that's an interesting shift.
Oh yeah,
the number 3 is a very prominent number in the Bible.
That's true.
So, yeah.
It's pretty prominent in like most mythologies.
It's a number of completeness.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of my mythology information comes from Harry Potter. So interesting talking about like the crow, because he does mention basilisks here, and at least in Harry Potter, the crowing of the cock is fatal to the basilisk, which is why Ginny Weasley has to kill all the chickens.
Harry Potter references.
You have me for the Potter references, guys. I can bring those any day of the week.
So there's also the use of objects to maybe keep the curse from coming back. He tells Foltest to have her wear an inclusion, and you get that nice recurring old school, as old as stories, where something is explained to the reader by having someone else in the story ask what the hell that is. And that's exactly what happens. He's like, have her wear an inclusion. He's like, what's an inclusion? And we're like, yeah, we all have that question too. What is an inclusion? And it's a stone, a gemstone with, in this case, with a pocket of air in it, but really it means anything. Like it could have, it doesn't have to be a pocket of air. It could be like another gemstone inside it that occurred naturally. So that's kind of neat. Contained, I guess, so that's the concept, is that it's containing that element within this stony prison, sort of. It's sort of a symbolic reference there, I guess. But he also
kind
mentioned
of a pregnancy metaphor, if you think about it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I am now.
Like kind of like maybe a I don't know, like a counterbalance to the corrupted pregnancy. I'm making stuff up, but yeah.
No, that's great.
So he also suggests juniper, bramble, juniper, broom, and aspen to burn in the room, in her room every once in a while, which is interesting. All these things, he goes really deep with his herbal research, because he throws out so many names of herbs, and I looked them all up, and they all seem to have a real connection to this. Like aspen is known to be an anxiety reducer, and it's sometimes used as a stake for vampire staking. Hawthorn is also used for that, and Hawthorn is mentioned in one of his elixirs. Bramble besom is broom, is actually derives from the word broom. So this bramble is what people made brooms out of back in the day. It's called besom, and that's also associated with like witches' brooms. And then the juniper is from Scottish and Gaelic, is been used for eons as a cleanser, as a blessing, as a protection kind of thing. So that obviously fits pretty well.
And then, of course, we have the use of silver, which is prominently used throughout all mythology as this kind of, holy substance, which can, repel evil or, imprison beasts. So this is something that, we see Geralt use his chain, and that breaks, and then we know shit is hitting the fan with the Striga in the fight. So that's something that's very interesting as well.
Yeah.
And of course, Geralt uses elixirs. Look, he had to basically endure all of these poisons to reach the state that he's in. So that's something that we're definitely going to be talking about more throughout this podcast.
Yeah,
child abuse.
So one more quote here, Michal, if you wouldn't mind.
The mixture which helped the witch gain full control of this body was chiefly made up of veratrum, stramonium, hawthorn, and spurge. The other ingredients had no name in any human language.
Spurge is
which is a really fucking cool sentence.
You love the word spurge.
I do love the word spurge. The fact that spurge is milky white and latex-like is and poisonous. So let me run through this real fast, and then you guys make some comments, because I couldn't. I went really off on I probably went too far with this research, but I couldn't help myself. Veratrum is also known as false hellebore. It's very poisonous. Native Americans would put it on their arrows. It's used as medicine as a last resort, because it's like a purgative. It's very, very powerful. Hawthorn, it was associated with the Fae in Ireland. It's also one of the, like I said, it's one of the wood types used to kill vampires in stakes. Stramonium, now this is the one that's crazy. Stramonium, aka Jimson weed, aka Datura, aka thornapple, aka moonflower, aka hell's bells, aka devil's weed, aka devil's cucumber, aka devil's trumpet, aka false castor oil, aka loco weed, aka stinkweed, aka prickly burr, aka tolguaca. It's a hallucinogen. It's a poison. It's very, very similar to belladonna. It's associated with the witch's ability to fly and Haitian zombies. So the reason it has all these names is the same thing with we were talking about with Striga, is there's just a ton of different real world traditions that speak to this herb that's grown all over the place, and they all have a different name for it. And as these traditions, as cultures clash and they use different names, new names form in between these groups, and it just gets so confusing. But it's pretty amazing to see that. There's
don't
some
use
theory.
This last one, by the way. Datura will make you. Yeah, you don't. This one is a strong one. You don't want to be ingesting this stuff.
People definitely trip and hallucinate off of this, and it's some thinking that it might be related to the ancient priests who would have visions, like the priest of Apollo or the some of the priests in Machu Picchu, maybe. So anyway,
Delphi.
that is wild. Yeah, Delphi. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh, all right. So basically, all of them are poison, and so Geralt is drinking poisons, but that's explained later.
So basically, this is not a recipe.
Yeah, don't try this at home.
we gotta remember that Geralt's built up this tolerance for years, and that's part of the trial of the grasses, which creatures taken. Some do not survive, so Geralt is one of the lucky ones.
Yeah, we'll have to do a whole episode on that at some point, because we want to cover the short stories, we're going to cover the books, but we also have, like Kyle said, we're going to cover individual topics that we decide are worth pulling together like that. That's probably a good example of one.
Mm-hmm. Do we want to speak a little bit about the curse before we move into locations?
I feel like we covered it, but if you all have something to add, then go for it.
No, I think we can move on to locations.
Yeah, I think it's an ominous, cool idea that, like, you can do everything, and still you might not be safe.
It took extreme measures for Geralt to get things done. That is for certain. So we can talk a little bit about Temeria, which is an interesting kingdom. Definitely some interesting things going on there. We see, obviously these anti-elven attitudes and stuff going on throughout the story, the xenophobia. So that's something that's interesting. And of course, we see how witchers are treated. So there's this is real world stuff. We know there's all sorts of different kingdoms, so obviously people are going to feel differently towards different cultures, and since they don't understand one as easy as the other, that's something that's prevalent throughout this chapter. We see a little bit of that. You want to speak a little bit about Temeria, Michal?
Temeria, sorry, I was on a different place in the doc. Yeah. So they're kind of xenophobic, like we see in the opening chapter, or the opening scene, where Geralt, just low-key murders some guys. And they generally have a not nice feeling for the elder races, like elves and dwarves, but they're cool with sorcerers. So there's a lot of different, like, kind of varieties of ways that people are prejudiced in the Witcher world, and some of them are okay with non-humans but hate sorcerers. Some of them hate everybody. There's a lot of different things. And
there's kind of a reason they see sorcerers and magic users in a better light. Is Thanedd Isle is quite close to Temeria.
That's true. We'll be talking about Thanedd more later. That's one of the places where there's a magic school. That's obviously really important. Aretuza is part of that. Yeah, that's certainly portrayed on the TV show pretty well. And of course, Temeria in general is just sort of central in terms of this northern section that all the action takes place throughout all the books. And that's part of what gets touched on with, Foltest having other things to do than deal with the Striga and how his neighbor wanted to marry the sister that died and all that. So that's too big a topic for now, but it's good to set the stage a bit. Nearby is
Vizim.
Yeah, it's the capital city, which is kind of on the Ismana River and Lake Visma. It's south of Magpie Forest. East is the Temple of Melitelli and Elander, which is where he'll go, which is where he's hanging out during the Voice of Reason. So that's just nearby, basically. But the short story Something More also passes through here. So there's going to be a few stories in Temeria, and then in the main novels, it's going to be pretty relevant. But
we'll definitely be doing some episodes. Probably, Nilfgaard is probably one that we could do later on once we, start to get farther into the story. Some of these smaller kingdoms that we don't have as much information. So specifically for the short stories, talking more about the plot and the story, but we will be doing some standalone episodes for those of you that are interested about learning more about the Witcherverse as we move on with the podcast.
Yeah.
And I think it's time to kind of get into the final part of the discussion here, and funniest moments. So I guess I'll go first because I kind of cheated and I said Geralt, before I go, tell me, why did you bite her to death? Hey, Geralt. The Geralt was asleep. I kind of jumped on that one in our shared document as my favorite. I just thought that was absolutely hilarious way to end a chapter.
By the way, why did he bite her? I mean, I guess he bit her because his blood was leaking so quickly he had to stop her before he passed out. But do you think there's more to it though? Either of you guys?
Oh, see, I think this is exactly what happens when you are petting your cat and the cat goes apeshit on you and like clamps around your arm and starts biting you. Because I never bit my cat, but like it was close.
I hope not.
You know, like there's a reason you like go for like a really violent kick sometimes at cats. Like, you know, it's an instinct. I love animals.
Yeah.
I also like not being in pain.
Yeah.
I think it was reactionary, honestly. I think that Geralt knew it. Like he was just like, okay, I gotta fight back. He's
Yeah.
bitter.
I do want to, I won't get into any details, but if you have read The Lady of the Lake, just remember, like, think about how the story ends in terms of things with teeth. And think about how it begins. I think it's a really interesting parallel that maybe in like 7 years we'll get to talk about.
What was your favorite quote, Michal?
So I have two. Well, a quote is when
That line, you know, same
right.
difference.
So when Geralt's talking to what's his face, the man with opinions, Valorad, right? And Geralt's like, oh, it's too late for your wisdom. One of the knowing ones should have been sent for. And he says, one of those charlatans with stars on their hats. And I'm just like, I just love how he goes for like the wizard, like the magician's apprentice, like the most stereotypical hilarious version. And I just also love that like Geralt misses the final battle with the Striga because he oversleeps. Like he's like, oh, okay, woke up. All right, she's human, cool. You know?
He wakes up and realizes it's been longer than he thought. He's like, oh.
I didn't miss the test. You know?
I pulled two lines. One is just pure comedy, which is when they're trying to dance around the topic of what to call the Striga, because one guy's like, no, it's a princess. You have to call her by her royal title. And Geralt's like, okay, the princess. What does the princess look like? And Valorad just gets frustrated. He's like, the princess looks like a Striga, like the most Strigish Striga I have
ever. The most Strigish, you know, like just like
Strigish. Yeah. That's such a good word. Like, what is that word? I'm new to the word Striga. You can't be making up other words on top of it already. But my actual favorite, even more favorite, is because it's not just funny, but it's meaningful. And when Geralt wakes up after being passed out for 2 days because of his neck wound, he's like, oh my God, what happened? The first thing he says is, my sword. And Valorad very sarcastically says, yes, what is most important is your Witcher's silver sword. Like all this stuff is happening and he's worried about his sword.
Yeah, he's all stubborn.
But it's true. Like Geralt, as we mentioned earlier, Geralt is very constantly on the edge of poverty. And if he doesn't have this silver sword, which is, you got to figure, ridiculously expensive, he's kind of out of a job. I mean, not out of a job, but he's sort of out of a job. Like he would have a lot harder time making a living. And in fact, it would mean he would probably have to start going against his code. He would probably have to start breaking his own ethic. He'd probably start to have to do bodyguard work and stuff like that if he didn't have the silver sword. So it's actually it is actually really important to his life, to his existence.
And something we'll see is, you know, the connection to his identity, like the totems of his Witcher vocation, you know, are deeply tied into his identity. And when things happen to those items, they impact the way he perceives himself.
Good point.
Yeah, so those are our favorite funny moments. We'll be doing that towards the end of our podcast when we get an episode up. We have a pirouette count of 3 and and then a roach watch 0.5.
Yeah, we want to kind of do that at the end of each episode. We want to count the pirouettes and count the roach sightings. So this was Michal, tell us about, this was your idea to do the pirouette count.
Yeah. He has 2 pirouettes, I think, during the fight, and then he references that his pirouettes are no longer going to fool the Striga.
And this is a big meme too with the people who play the games, because there's the fighting system, the pirouettes he does. Yeah, it's just really funny.
It's just such a funny word to use in translation. It's like it's probably not the word I would have gone for, but it does evoke grace. That's for sure.
If you ever read or listen to any of the swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, who some would say maybe he's the greatest swordsman who ever lived. He wrote the book something of Five Rings, and he would talk about how if you're going to be a swordsman, you need to learn calligraphy, because you want to flow and have these unwasted motions. And so it makes sense. It's like again, I'll make a Game of Thrones reference. What Sirio Farrell's talking about. He's like, you're not just hacking. You're just hacking over and over. You want movements that are complete. You don't want to stop and start. You want to flow. And a pirouette is absolutely that. So it works really well as something to goof on, but it is also very sensible.
So yeah, that's pretty much going to do it for today. Next time, in the next podcast, we're going to be doing A Grain of Truth with all of our favorite characters, the villain. No, Michal doesn't like.
I feel like saying next time on.
What
do we call next time on the Pot of Surprise? Rape, roses, and what is that thing?
Talk about not having a mess. Talk about the not having a happily ever after.
Yeah.
So about Game of Thrones references. We have Tormund, and we have the initials of A Grain of Truth being AGOT.
That's a great one. So before we get to our outro here, where can we find both of you? I did put the links to all of the Michal's and Aziz's social media in the description of the video. You can find all that there. But yeah, a little bit about where we can find you.
You can find me on Twitter. I'm at InkAsRain. That's INKASRAIN. And you can find most of my writing at hypeable.com. I also do the Level 7 Access podcast, the Nice Jewish Fangirls podcast, and the Vassals of Kingsgrave podcast, and possibly more podcasts, because there's not a lot else to do right now.
Vassals of Kingsgrave is one of me and Aziz both agree, one of our favorites.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you guys have been around. It's great. Yeah.
So links in the description for her.
Yeah, and on my end, you can find me at historyofwesteros.com or the History of Westeros YouTube channel, or anywhere you can download podcasts. There are History of Westeros episodes, and the same ditto goes for Twitter and Facebook and all that. And I am super excited. We've gotten this started. We've been talking about doing it for a while, and we're just getting started. So much more fun to go. I'm excited to introduce this to a lot of y'all, and for those of y'all who already know it, well, I'm glad we are getting it going for that reason, because I think this is just going to keep growing, and this is just the beginning.
Yeah, the Witcher fandom, great fandom. Speaking of Witcher fandom, witcher.fandom.com, where you can find some really, really interesting info on characters and kingdoms and beasts. Got some of our information that we got on the podcast from there. So we'll put that in the description of the video, so you can go check that out. Vampires.fandom.com for a lot of the awesome stuff that Aziz found on vampires.
Like a vampire Wikipedia. It's really well researched, even.
Of course, if you enjoyed this, please feel free to toss a like and subscribe to not only my channel.
Toss a like to your Witcher.
Toss a like to your Witcher. Or YouTuber, podcaster. We'll have to change the song a little bit. It really helps out the channel, of course, and allows us to keep on doing this thing. And don't forget to rate the podcast as well. Like we said, going to be coming a little bit later, but that's the thing you can do once we get what platforms are we going to be doing it on, Aziz?
Yeah, it should be up on every podcatcher that you can think of. It might not be up on, the one exception might be Stitcher, but it should be up on Spotify, iTunes, Acast, Podbean, iHeartRadio. These days, most of the time, if you can get a podcast up on one of those, it's going to pop on all of them, and I have experience with that. So we should be, this first episode, like Kyle said, I don't know.
We're going to create a Facebook page and that kind of stuff. Yeah. More announcements are coming.
The submission process for new podcasts might be a little slowed down given what's happening in the world right now, but we'll get it up as soon as possible, and then it'll be the place to find the edited versions of these going forward.
Yeah, so we'll be doing a Facebook page, all that. I know some of you have already asked about a Patreon. We'll figure that out maybe a little bit later. Thank you, of course, everyone that donated today. We hope that you enjoyed episode number 1 of the podcast of Surprise. Like we said, this is only the beginning of what we're going to be, analyzing and discussing from the Witcherverse together on the pod. We would love, of course, if all of you would join the conversation and let us know about what your favorite thoughts and favorite moments from the chapter were in the comment section. Like I said, we'll be setting up some more social media on that and be on the lookout for some more announcements. So yeah, we invite each and every one of you who is excited to learn more about The Witcher or already loves The Witcher to our community. Thanks for watching, and we will see you all on the next episode of the Pod of Surprise.
Bye.
Bye. Toss